Gravedigger Queen here, coming at you via Furlong. I, the Gravedigger Queen, has accepted the task of rearing my foster baby, the City of Furlong. We all like the idea of setting up franchises, but the thing about that, children, is your business has to at least be successful before you do it. Well, all that means is the once great City of Furlong channel lives on through us. Mama Bear will cradle the great City of Furlong stories under her ample bosom and take it into her heart. Originally, Furlong was about one big city told through little tiny micro stories. But tonight, we will tell it in one big clump. Let me tell you this, children, once we get through all the stories that were once Furlong, we will get to the stories of Furlong that are yet to be. But until that time, we will give you Furlong in chunks. Tonight's tale is about a man named Norman who just wanted to find himself a little jobby job. He is introduced to a staple of Furlong, the LaCroix building, which has a long history of fucked up shit. And little by little, he figures that out. Initially, this was a cluster of little stories, but the Gravedigger Queen gon' name this little baby child. The name of this tale is Evil Enters the Workforce by Montsho Shelby. Norman was excited when he got a call back to work at the LaCroix building. It was the first thing that people who weren't from Furlong remembered about Furlong. No one outside of the city knew that the LaCroix building was a place where most media was produced. Sure, when it was ready for a shiny sheen of paint and polished, the nuts and bolts of the finished projects were filmed in Formico Studios. But all the big ideas had come through this building before it became anything that the public would see. Norman sat in a conference room of this iconic building, waiting to be acknowledged. But he had been there so long, the thrill of a new job was becoming overridden by feelings of boredom. The room he sat in was innocuous and had the identity of any waiting room. There was a drab uniformity to the place that made it unsettling. Norman sat in a black leather lounge chair. Instead of fiddling with his phone, he reached for a magazine on the table. He made a loud scrunch on the letter when he leaned forward. There, he found an architectural magazine which had the LaCroix building prominently displayed. He read an article about the building just from the lack of other stimuli in the room. Of the 72 stories of the building, the last 20 levels on the top windows was a huge monitor. Being from Furlong, Norman knew that much. Anyone could see the LaCroix building playing a movie scene or featuring a nature clip from miles away. This week featured an exotic aquarium. Norman found an even lesser known fact that the LaCroix building was a gift from Ballister LaCroix to his betrothed Delphine Osterberg. Being from Furlong, he knew of the LaCroix and the Osterbergs, which was considered the marital merger that brought the city back to life after it was hit by an economic downturn. He breathed out and looked around while tossing the magazine back on the table. Some people considered this level of isolation a form of torture, and he was beginning to see why. Suddenly, an old bald woman appeared from nowhere on a screen that had been white-walled just a moment before. Norman jumped at the sudden appearance of a face out of nowhere. "Are you Norman Everman?" said the old, smooth-shaven, bald woman in the black turtleneck. Yes, I am," Norman said defensively. The way her camera leaned and stretched, one might assume she was FaceTiming while walking around. At times, her eye would become big moving forward, or she would be further away. "I looked at your credentials and you are an acceptable match for the job position," she said dryly while her eye became larger on the monitor. "You may report to your immediate superior now so that you might get a jump start on what we require of you." "Okay," Norman said, happy to have gotten the job, but taken off guard that it was starting immediately. "Follow me, Norman," said the abrasive bald woman who must have been in her 70s or possibly even 80s. Where are—" Another monitor appeared and Norman began to understand that he was meant to follow the breadcrumbs. Norman got up and began to march at a brisk pace. The woman turned her camera to the side to simulate that she was walking beside him. A secret door slid open that he did not at first see that led Norman down a hallway he hadn't suspected was there. He began to struggle to keep pace with the rapidly appearing monitors that popped up sporadically throughout his trip. There were somber but extremely busy people who had their phones out in front of them, speaking as if they were doing live streams or speaking to people, but because of how fast they were moving, he couldn't quite make it out. "Hey, excuse me," Norman said to the old woman, whose face turned back from the screen to face him, then centered to be face to face the moment he caught up. "I didn't even get your name, miss," Norman asked. "My name is Delphine Osterberg. Do keep up. I can't stand a young man with low constitution," she said, apathetic to Norman's problem. Her monitors began bouncing on to new monitors until they reached an elevator at the end of the hall. Norman was walking so fast it fell more into running. When the elevator door opened, a monitor appeared behind him. It was as if the old woman's eye were bearing down on him, even though he was unsure how much she could see of him. "We move fast here, Norman. Listen to your superiors and be ready to pitch at any time. Even the best ideas can come from the lowliest people," said Delphine. Norman took a moment to catch his breath before asking, "Delphine Osterberg? Are you kin to the Delphine Osterberg that revitalized the city?" The old woman smiled slightly. "You know your history. I like that," she said without answering. "Now remember what I said and you'll go far." The elevator doors opened and a man was standing there with his arms behind his back. "Norman Everman?" he asked. "Yeah?" "Follow me," said the man. Norman began to walk behind the man briskly. "Have you ever—" the strange man was about to say before another man came jogging down the hallway with papers spilling from his hands. "I quit. I can't do this anymore. I don't know what else you think you can take from me." Suddenly, from a previously unseen sliding door came two faceless security guards dressed in black. The man spun and ran towards Norman and the man he was following, papers flying all over the place as he dashed to the slowly closing elevator. Behind the two security guards was a man in an all-black poncho chasing them with a professional camera hiding his face. Norman leaned on the wall to get out of the man's way. The man yelled maniacally at Norman, barely stopping to address him. "Get out now! Get out now before you start making pitches! Just get out!" Norman moved out of the fleeing man's way so as to not get involved in any of the drama that was unfolding. The haggard man moved past Norman to the elevator that was slowly closing like waning hope. "Come on, Norman. We get a lot of people that are too stressed out to properly do the job. The burnout ratio is rather high here," said Norman's supervisor while leading him away. Norman looked back down the hallway curiously while the two security guards picked the man off the floor like an impudent child who was in the midst of a tantrum. All the while, the hooded man with the huge camera loomed over him, filming his breakdown as if it were peak cinema. "My recommendation is to get a lot of exercise and take your vitamins." "Do you take vitamins, Norman?" asked the supervisor. Norman stayed silent for a long while before he realized he was being addressed. "No, I never really thought about it." The supervisor stopped at a room that had carts upon carts of mail. As cluttered as the carts were, there was an eerie hive-like order to the place. On the back wall, there were pressurized canisters that dropped from tubes into waiting carts. Norman could see there was a tiny grated window that led to a room next to his, and he could hear the same machine noises going on there as it did in the room he was currently in. He didn't have time to inspect it fully, so he said nothing and let his supervisor speak. "This is your desk here. You'll sort the mail, then you'll take it to where it needs to go in the building. You have a few other people doing this job on this floor. If you get confused, ask one of them for help before you bring it to me. I'll be around. For now, I think we'll start you on sorting for a while, and in an hour or so, I'll show you how to log," said the supervisor, pointing at the singular computer in the room. "Okay, I'll leave you to it for now," said the supervisor before just exiting with no further explanation. Norman surveyed the room and had absolutely no idea what he was supposed to be doing. Out of the 6 tubes in the room, he noticed a small red light next to one blinked, and not 10 seconds later, a capsule shot out of the wall and slid onto the floor. Out of the several carts in the room, there were not enough of them to catch all the capsules. The pill-shaped thing rolled onto the floor. Norman picked it up and tossed it in a random cart. The flow of mail didn't happen at breakneck speeds, but it was consistent enough that you couldn't ignore it and drift off. He had been at it for 10 minutes, though it felt like an hour. It was his hope that whatever the other parts of this job were, balanced out the boredom of this part. Hey, man, you over there? Came a voice from the grates. Norman looked over and into the stall next to his. You can make out another man through the tiny grate, vaguely doing what he was doing. You new, man? Asked the man in the wall. Yeah, I am. It's my first day. Cool. How you liking it, man? Well, I think it's a bit boring, I don't... Yeah, I know, right? Look, this job here is just a jumping off point. If you play your cards right, you can move up fast, said the man in the wall. Oh, really? Yeah, really, man. You just gotta be ready to pitch. Pitch at any time, at any place, on any subject. Like, what do you mean? Okay. Like, give me some words. What do you mean, words? Like anything, just anything. Okay. Baseball, donkey, hearts. Yeah, that'll work. What about a show about an ex-baseball player who moves in with a heart surgeon and a donkey? Why's the donkey there? Look, man, just let me cook, okay? I got skills. Okay, man, Norman said as the silence deepened on the other side of the grate. You still there, man? Norman asked. Dude, I'm thinking. I think I cracked this shit. So the donkey was there because the surgeon was going to do an experimental surgery on the baseball player where he used a piece of his heart to help his heart condition. The baseball player has to be nice to the donkey and keep him happy because it saved his life. And the name of the show is Get Off My Ass. Damn, that is pretty good, man. It is, isn't it? Why the fuck am I giving you ideas for free? Look, man, I'll be around. Who are you? Oh, me. I'm Carlos, man. Norman spent the first week of the job as an observer, and though he hadn't outright seen anything that gave him red flags so big he'd quit, he encountered quite a lot of little things that raised major questions. Everyone was always in a hurry, and everyone was absolutely terrified to lose their jobs, especially the higher up you went up the chain. In the week he had been there, he had personally seen 2 more people have nervous breakdowns and quit. Each and every time a cameraman would emerge out of nowhere for some reason he couldn't begin to understand. Norman realized that Carlos absolutely loved his job. He seemed uniquely qualified to deal with and enjoy the bizarre chaos of this place. After a few days, Norman fell into a routine, and Carlos, for whatever reason, liked to be around him. Norman believed that he liked him because he didn't stop him when he riffed and ranted. The two rode the elevator up to the 12th floor. Carlos rambled as he tended to do, and at this point, Norman no longer had the mental bandwidth to do anything about it. If I were to pick, I'd go 90s action and 80s for horror, said Carlos. What about the aughts? Questioned Norman. The aughts? I don't know, man. Sort of the rise of reality shows and TV, if you ask me. As the two rode their carts down the hall, they looked into a clear glass boardroom, and a man turned to them, holding his gut in utter agony. With one hand, he held in blood that dripped from his stomach, and the other hand, he struggled to hold himself up, making bloody streaks on glass. Oh shit, Carlos emoted. The other people in the boardroom with him looked at their injured colleague with the casual indifference of Roman emperors. One man, who was standing very nonchalantly, put his ear to his phone. Norman rushed into the boardroom, and the 12 people inside were not frantically panicking about the man who was bleeding out, but pitching ideas about something. Maybe a movie. Norman wasn't quite listening. He held the man up, who slowly was making his way out of the room. Don't worry, you can drop him there. Security is on their way, said the man who was on the phone. Fuck security. Call 911. Norman insisted. I'd suppose security would decide on that, the presenter stated. The man lurched onto the floor with only Norman to slowly guide him down. He coughed up blood. Norman seemed to be the only one that cared at this point. Even Carlos's attention had drifted and had fixated on the corporate conversation. Okay, how would we utilize the city if he was going to do that? We definitely need Brody Danger in on this, said one of the interchangeable suits. Perhaps a bank heist, one blurted. No, a finale and shootout at a Pelico concert hall, said another. No, it's too easy, said one of the suits. Carlos blurted. Furlong has always been about racing. If you're going on location here, you need to do chases on the fairway. The presenter tilted his head as if impressed, but not overly impressed. Norman blurted out in disgust. This man is dying. If we don't do something right now, he won't make it. Norman saw the corporate suits slowly look into each other and nodding. All 12 looked to Norman and began clapping. Norman grimaced in annoyance. That's it. He's on the fairway. It's a race against time. He has to save people around the city or they die. Maybe the city dies. No, we'll workshop it, said the presenter. You, said the presenter pointing at Norman. You're invited to our pitch meeting. What? Norman said while cradling the dying man. No, wait, I'm with him. We're riding team, Carlos said urgently. Norman looked to Carlos, who was pleading for him to co-sign the wild accusation with his eyes. Yeah, sure, whatever, Norman said. Before the corporates could get back to formulating the beats of this potential movie, 2 security guards entered the room. They violently yanked the man from Norman's arms. Hey, you shouldn't be! Before he finished, the cameraman ran into the room unusually fast. Norman had never been so close to the cameraman, but his face was obscured by the camera and a hooded poncho. He did, however, get a look at his hands, and they were deformed, as if they were melted. At a quick glance, it nearly looked fused to the metal. The security guards took the bleeding man by either arm and drug him away. The overeager cameraman quickly trailed them like a vulture circling a kill. You can't do that to him! We begin location scouts in a few days, said the corporate presenter. We expect your team to be ready and available. What team? We will be. We're ready. We were born ready, Carlos said to the corporate suits, talking over Norman as to not sour the deal. Carlos picked Norman up from the floor. Norman's eyes scrambled to keep track of where the injured man was, but just that fast he had lost sight of them. Come on, we have to get our shit straight, man, said Carlos, pushing Norman out of the door. Norman looked around in a daze, unsure of exactly what had just happened. Norman stayed silent the next day at work because he couldn't get over how people were so willing to step over each other for the sake of media. He had never actually worked with producers and creatives, so he didn't know if this was just a LaCroix thing or how all these movie types acted. Carlos, on the other hand, was ecstatic and he couldn't stop talking about this location scout. It was a day until the location scout and he absolutely was dreading it. Carlos couldn't wait, and the promise of a dragon's hoard of money had his eyes wide. Norman had settled down for bed at approximately 11:20 p.m. when he got an unexpected ring at his doorbell. Norman, is that the door? Came the voice of his aging mother. It is, Ma. I'll check on it. No need for you to get up, Norman insisted. He had never gotten a surprise visitor this late, even counting the days of his youth. He wandered to the darkened door, and the outside motion lights had something in its sights. Who is it? Norman asked. It's Brody Danger, said the voice in his distinctively British tough guy accent. Norman rolled his eyes. There was absolutely no way one of the biggest action movie stars of the past 20 years just randomly showed up at his door. Okay, sure, he said, smiling, attempting to filter out the sarcasm. When he looked out of his peephole, there Brody Danger stood. He was a bit shy of 6 feet, a bit balding, but built like a UFC fighter who hadn't taken any serious damage to the face. Yeah, are you sure you have the right house? Who is it, Norman? Blurted his mother. I don't know, Ma. That's what I'm trying to figure out, said Norman. I don't have all day, Brody said impatiently. Are we gonna do this location scout or what? Said one of the biggest action stars in America. I thought it was tomorrow, and I definitely didn't think you were gonna show up personally. Look, Brody Danger does what Brody Danger does. Little known fact about me, When I pick up a project, I throw myself in it deep. There is no part of the process too mundane. Now you're gonna open this door." Norman opened the door. He was amazed he was actually talking himself out of meeting up with a man whose movies he adored his entire life. "That's what I'm talking about, my son. Get on your coat and we're taking a ride." "Norman, who's at the door?" came Norman's mother's voice. It's a friend from work," said Norman. "Do you want me to handle your mom? I tend to do well with women in the over 60 demographic." "No, that'll be okay. I honestly don't know if she'd survive the shock. Let's go," Norman insisted. Brody walked with his shoulders held high and arms out like a 1920s tough guy, but his bad boy reputation was said to be well earned. He walked through Norman's quaint residential neighborhood like a bull in a china shop. Norman could see Carlos in the window of a modded-up Mazda, which was black with yellow accent lines. Norman noticed the cameraman wordlessly gazing at the two approach with its huge, unblinking mechanical eye. "Is he filming?" asked Norman. "The moment I agree to shoot, I start filming," said Brody. The cameraman wordlessly got into the back seat with Carlos. When Brody hit the ignition, he looked over to the two and said, "Okay, you two are the geniuses that crafted the scene, so what is it?" Brody asked as he stepped on the gas and gunned the Mazda. It went off screaming automotive mayhem. I don't," Norman started to say. Carlos jumped in. "It's a race against time. You need to save people driving around the city." "Why would I be doing that?" Brody asked as he ran a red light. Norman buckled his seatbelt. Because Carlos stammered. He obviously hadn't written that far ahead and was attempting to make it on the fly. "It doesn't matter. Let's just do a little first things first and improv it on the fly." Brody gunned the engine full speed. They traveled northbound and was a few blocks from the Kismet Expressway, which would lead them to the serendipitous Fate District. They moved in a blur. "Mr. Danger, is it possible for you to slow down?" asked Norman. "Yeah, I could, but the script demands I don't. And can't nobody say I ain't method." "I don't know what that means, but we're doing over 100 on the street. Do you think?" Suddenly, Brody downshifted, hit the brake and the emergency brake. He put the car into a full-on power slide. Norman screamed as the centrifugal force pinned him to the door. The car violently slammed into a man pushing a shopping cart. The impact threw him a half a block down. "What the man? What the blurted Norman. Carlos all but cheered from the back. "You hit that guy," Norman said earnestly, even though it was painfully obvious. Brody Danger looked at him and said, "I know. The script says I need to save a life, don't it? Now, be a good lad and scoop him up so we can race him to safety." Norman ran out of the car towards the injured man. Carlos ran up behind him with a smile that was unsettlingly amused. The all-seeing eye of the camera scuttled out of the vehicle. It stopped ever so briefly to face Brody Danger for the hero's reaction shot, but quickly turned back to Norman and Carlos, seeing that was where the true carnage lay. They couldn't see where the wily man was hit because of the onion-like layers of clothes. Norman bent low to pick him up. The man screamed in pain. "Maybe we should call an ambulance. Moving him might be a bad idea," said Norman. "Look, the script, as of draft 1, says I rush citizens to the hospital. I'll be damned if I'll let some asshole driving a modded-out ice cream truck steal my glory. Now stop dicking about and toss him in," said Brody. If the situation wasn't one of life or death, Norman would have told Brody to go fuck himself, but it was one of life and death, and he didn't have time to. Carlos grabbed the dusty bum under an arm and ignored his screaming pleas. The fit was tight, and the Mazda wasn't equipped to handle 5 people with ease. Norman slid in the backseat with the vagrant and Carlos. The cameraman scrambled to be relevant and ended up in the passenger seat. He immediately took out the headrest so that he had better angles to shoot the carnage. The moment that the door slammed shut, Brody hit the gas. "Okay, mate, where we off to?" Brody said with extreme calm. You don't know where we're going? I thought you read a script or something, Norman said with frustration. I read a spec script. I know the general beats, but I don't know everything that's destined to happen. Shit. Okay, make this turn, Norman blurted. Get on the Kismet, right here, Norman yelled with urgency. Brody nearly missed the turn to the expressway because of how fast he was going. He turned on a dime and threaded the needle getting on the exit. The cameraman turned around to record some of Norman's panicked reactions. The Mazda weaved in and out of traffic, nearly missing horrific crashes. The silhouette and blinking lights of serendipitous fate closed. This is living, eh, boys? Said Brody with a defiant chuckle at death, and a cheeky smirk to Carlos and Norman. Eyes on the road, Norman pleaded as the tail lights of a slow-moving truck threatened to pancake them. Brody narrowly avoided rear-ending the behemoth. Here! Norman yelled while frantically pointing at the exit. Brody swerved the car onto the on-ramp, and they managed to pull up on a hospital situated in the midst of a place that celebrated excess and would not sleep to slow down. Come on! Yelled Brody as he got out of the car and helped Carlos drag the now unconscious man to the doors of the emergency room. Norman put both hands on top of his head in disbelief. He tried to breathe again, only to find that there was no time for it. Brody and Carlos left the injured man by the shuttering mechanical doors and made a break for the car. Come on, Brody said with equal measure urgency and excitement. It was rumored that Brody Danger did all of his own stunts, but after this display, Norman no longer doubted it. Whether it was the excitement of the moment or fear of having to explain what they did to authorities, Norman ran back to the car with the 3, including the cameraman whose head seemed to be eternally cocked and leaning on his machine. Norman hopped in the front seat and the Mazda peeled off into the swirling mess of nighttime colors. Good work, lads. So another? Said Brody. What the fuck do you mean? The script had us saving multiple people, which would denote at least 2. This is one hell of a dry run. This is an excellent city for vehicle-related mayhem, if I do say so myself. Alright, boys, lock in. Where's the next hospital? Brody asked Carlos or Norman. What are you saying? Norman started to say. Brody was already lining up his sights on a woman in her 20s who looked a bit tipsy with the crosshairs of his grill. What are you? Norman said as the speed knocked the wind from him. Brody cut the steering wheel and twisted the car so that it power slide into the girl. It was a masterful feat of driving talent, and he hadn't killed the last man going as fast as he was, but that didn't make what he did any less deviant. In the fractions of seconds that they had before impact, Norman made a choice. He chose to be the type of man that wouldn't let something like this happen instead of the passenger. He yanked the wheel, pulling with all he had to miss the woman that was too out of sorts to rightfully notice the level of danger she was in. The car squealed. They made another rotation. The Mazda smacked into a light pole, then pinballed into a brick wall in an alley. The airbags deployed. Things went white. When Norman came to, the unblinking eye of the camera was in his face, except the cameraman's poncho was ripped. With his head filled with haze, he could see the cameraman's head was fused to the camera. It had no eyes, barely a nose, and if it had a skull, it had to be cracked or stretched out of place. The thing wasn't just fused to the camera was its face. Norman leaned back in horror, but when he did, he felt 2 hands grab him and drag him over the broken glass through the driver's side. Now you did it, you fucking git, said Brody, who bled from his head. Norman had thrown Brody Danger's schedule of vehicular mayhem off by facilitating a car crash, and the British-born actor was none too fond of it. Norman picked himself up from the concrete in the alley. The carefree lights of the city illuminated their backs. Brody's anger did not relent. I don't come over to your job and knock the mop out of your hand, do I? Brody said nearly as a hypothetical scenario. I'm in the mailroom, Norman croaked out with rising fear. "Whatever." He jumped when the cameraman scurried on top of the roof of the car. Now that his clothes had been damaged, it revealed the horrific creature it was, something less than human, but part machine. Its crumpled and stretched skin and neck fused into the side of the camera, which was its true face. "So what do we plan to do about you, if you're gonna impede production?" said Brody as he advanced on Norman. Brody Danger was a bona fide bad boy, a stuntman turned actor with expert levels of several martial arts, and looking at him now, it was clear that none of these titles were exaggerated. Norman stepped back in fear. The monstrous eye of the camera loomed on them both. As Brody raised a hand to strike Norman, something smashed him in the back of the head. Carlos stood behind Brody with a broken-off side view mirror in his hand. The injured actor stumbled down to his knees, and the gash that was already on his head deepened. "Let's go, man!" Carlos yelled to Norman with urgency. Norman didn't waste time. He sprinted after Carlos, who had already started down the alley. The two looked behind them and noticed the ghastly cameraman chasing after them. "What's that?" Carlos said with excitement and fear. "I don't know, man," Norman replied with labored breaths. Suddenly, the cameraman stopped. Carlos used that moment to toss a bottle at it that happened to be laying on the ground. The mutant creature dropped down into a seated position. "You fucked yourselves now, my son," said Brody Danger from the end of the alley. He hopped to his feet and charged at the two. Even with a sizable head start, the actor was in much better shape than either man and easily began closing distance. Though it was hard to see from the distance they were, there was a fleshy tentacle that snaked out of Brody's skull. Carlos and Norman ran harder. When Brody passed the cameraman, who was seated, it reflexively scuttled backwards, facing on all fours to get out of the scene, then up the wall like a spider, all the while its eyes stayed fixed on either them or Brody. The two fled. Neither man felt good about their odds, even though they could see they were approaching the end of the alley. "I'll break left, you break right, okay?" said Carlos. Norman nodded. He was too exhausted to talk and run as it was. "Good luck, man," Carlos said, slapping Norman on the back. Norman nodded in acknowledgement and veered off the moment there were more choices to make. He turned to look back when he was half down the street, only to see Danger went after Carlos, and he had absolutely no clue where the cameraman was. Up to this point, he wasn't sure about whose side Carlos was on, but he knew now that he at least wasn't cool with him getting beat to death in an alley. From there, Norman had a lot on his mind. He had seen things that shook him to the core, that he could not explain to himself or to anyone for that matter. These people knew where he lived. With the job in on it, they had to be right. Should he uproot his elderly mother so he could get away from these people that may or may not have had sinister designs for him? At the end of the day, he chose to head home. He figured it was best to look over his mother and attempt to convince her to leave for a time. As for work, he'd definitely have to call off for a few days before making his next move. 2 nights was all Norman could convince his mother to stay at a hotel for, and they came back in the middle of the next day. He had cooked up a story about an early birthday present, and honestly, he wished he were clever enough to have just thought of that without the threat of mortal danger. He wasn't exactly sure what he was expecting to see when he returned. He checked his house before his mother entered, grabbing a kitchen knife just in case, going through closets and under beds. When he felt it was clear, he brought her in. He turned his phone back on and there were 2 messages from work, but none from Carlos. He hoped that Brody hadn't killed him, whatever he was. The first message was his supervisor explaining that if he went 3 straight days sick, he'd need a doctor's note of some sort. Though it was the second message that sent a chill down his spine. The message was from Delphine Osterberg herself. "This is Delphine Osterberg calling for Norman Everman. I'd like to congratulate you on your first location scout. Brody Danger speaks very highly of your potential, though it was explained to me a rather unpleasant complication that happened. Despite the snafu, we believe you could potentially still become a very sound pitchman and content creator. Please come into work and do not let this minor setback ruin what could be a very lucrative career. Please give us a reply, Mr. Everman, unless you prefer we send over representatives to your home to speak about your future. Good day to you, said Delphine before ending the recording. Norman looked down, then over to his mother, who was making her way into the house with her walker. He may have thought he was done with the job, but it certainly wasn't done with him yet. At the end of the day, Osterberg Entertainment were not the type of people you broke away from cleanly. With all the weird shit that Norman had been through, he would have been content to never go back to the LaCroix building again. But with the CEO of the company taking a personal interest in him and all but threatening to drop in on him at his house, he had to take that seriously. He considered buying a gun, but not only did he not have a firearms card, he didn't have the time to legally obtain one. And he wasn't the type of guy that knew how to work outside of the law. He settled on bringing a knife, then rethought that decision on account of not knowing how to use it or where to put it. He went with a box cutter. It was simple enough that he didn't feel as if he'd accidentally cut himself just carrying it. After the disaster with Brody Danger, whatever he was, he didn't think he was getting out of this alive and awkwardly wrote a note for his mother to find if he did not return. In the end of the day, this weirdness made him assess his life and really look at it objectively. He didn't believe that he really got a chance to live it. He got to work at 7 a.m. and even looking at the monitor on the top 20 floors displaying a Roman eye sent a shiver down his spine. It was almost as if the eye were following him. Norman looked around as nervously as a rabbit who knew that most things that existed in the world wanted to eat them. As far as things went, he wouldn't have been able to separate this day from any other day he had had here up till now. The only thing that was different was the knowledge that there were monsters here. He clocked in and began his work in the mailroom as per usual, and was waiting for any moment Brody Danger or the creature fused together into the camera to appear. He noticed that Carlos wasn't there, and in fact, there was no one there. This wasn't completely odd because there were times that all of the mailroom may have been making deliveries. But after an hour, it became odd that no one just happened to show up. There was no idle conversation, only the droning of machine noise. The unusual silence was deafening, and he could no longer take the waiting. He dared to sort the mail and started his rounds throughout the building early. He usually did the floors concurrently because that was the most efficient way to, but he decided to break from the norm and went directly to the 13th floor. He moved amongst the producers and pitchmen. People moved about too busy to be bothered by the likes of him, absorbed by the majesty of their phones and the sounds of their own voices. He dropped off pieces of mail here and there to people who barely acknowledged his presence. As he passed an office whose door was open, he thought he saw Carlos wearing a suit. He stopped and backed up to confirm what he had seen. There, clear as day, was Carlos sitting at a desk at his computer typing. As relieved as Norman was to see Carlos was alive, he was also unnerved to see him here. "Hey, what up, buddy?" said Carlos gleefully. Norman slowly looked both ways down the hall before closing his door. "What happened to you? After, you know," said Norman in a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, that. Nothing. Brody was mad for a minute, roughed me up a little for hitting him. Then I got a call and they said they liked our test footage. So they offered me a job as a junior associate producer. I'm sort of surprised you didn't get one." Norman thought about it, and he quite possibly may have, but he had his phone turned off and didn't bring it with him, so if they did leave a message, he wouldn't have gotten it. "You took the job? Even after all the freaky shit we saw? Even after what Brody did?" Norman asked urgently. Carlos was so calm about it that it made Norman seem unhinged by comparison. "All that? Come on, man. I talked to Brody and even he said maybe he shouldn't have went off the rails." "And the cameraman?" Carlos shrugged as if it just wasn't as big a deal to him as it was to Norman. You should probably talk to the boss. She can probably get you that job still. I could pull you in now that I'm in. We're boys, right? Carlos said, extending his fist for a bump. Norman reluctantly bumped fists. Norman didn't know what to do or how to handle any of the things he was currently dealing with, so he waited for it to come to him. Perhaps he was making more out of this than he needed to. Perhaps this was just an odd one-time event that was a fluke of fate that would not repeat itself. If the company really wanted him dead or worse, what could he do about it? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. So he went back to work and waited for the other shoe to drop. After an entire work week, things normalized and the mailroom seemed much like the mailroom, and they even ended up hiring someone to replace Carlos's old position. Aside from the occasional workplace freakout, there wasn't anything overtly supernatural going on. Norman did make it a point not to pitch ideas, so the chances of rising higher in the company was a non-issue. When he had thought that things had normalized, it was something as simple as an opened door that pulled him back into madness. Norman was painfully aware of the plethora of hidden passages that ran all throughout the building. So when he got to work, on a day like any other, there was a slightly cracked door open that he had no prior knowledge of, right behind the mailroom cove he worked. He sorted the mail and attempted to ignore it, but throughout the day, he heard odd moans and wails distantly. He closed his eyes in contemplation. He wanted to let it go. He wanted to put his head down and mind his own f***ing business. But it felt every time he tried, things got a little odder until he absolutely had to address it. I just can't think of anything, okay? He heard someone yelling from a great distance. Norman got up, left his post, and listened to the slightly cracked open door for greater context. Please, can anybody hear me? Is anybody out there? The voice cried for help. Norman nearly closed the door, but the decent part of him, the part that was human, couldn't ignore a cry for help. He put his fingers in the cracks of the door and ventured in. Norman ventured deeper into the bowels of the LaCroix building. He knew instinctively that it was not a place that men like him should tread. It was the muffled cry for help that beckoned him, but the lower he went, the more he began to rethink his decision. On top of the steadily rising plea for help, other voices announced themselves. The walls were white and sterile still, but the lights had become fleeting and far between. Before long, Norman found himself jumping from islands of light through oceans of darkness, perhaps being guided by sirens to dash him onto the rocks. Hello? Is anyone there? I can't do this. Just let me go. I can't do it anymore. The voice reached out into the ether for anyone to reply. That was the voice that Norman focused on, though there was a cacophony of other voices all speaking at once. They didn't appear to be speaking to one another, but all in private conversations that only managed to make a hush whisper of gentle noise. Norman felt as if the walls were swelling and contracting, as if he were in the belly of a sleeping beast. But if that were the case, that would mean it didn't matter where he went. He was already f***ed. The lights went completely away for a time, and Norman walked down a hallway of nothingness. He pulled his cell phone and let its light become a lantern in the darkness, even though he could barely see a foot from his face. All the voices started to become clear, and he could hear tidbits of thoughts and ideas whispered into the void. The man was a talking t-shirt, and it convinces him to kill his wife. So Dan, Sue, and Plato find it wasn't about the quest, but the friends they made along the way. And Roscoe is kicked off the island, but he blows up. He doesn't want to leave. Hello? Somebody! Help! Said the one voice that was yelling and not speaking in a conversational tone. Norman noticed an eerie blue glow that was brightening a much bigger room ahead. As he approached, he dared to speak up, even though a part of him didn't want to. I'm coming. Hold on, said Norman loudly. Are you talking to me? Said the voice. Yes, I'm coming, hold on, Norman said again. Slowly, Norman approached. He gasped in horror at what he saw. The room was massive, about the size of a basketball court. In the middle of the room was a dim, flickering blue glow. It felt much like the shade of color that came from a television. That alone might have been chilling on its own, but it was the wires and cables of all sizes that poured out of the massive hole that were connected to people that almost looked to be fused into the walls of the dome-like room. That was worse. The wall was littered with people attached to the wires of this hole. It was hard to tell how they were fused at all. It was as if they were functions of the machine. The eerie blue light shone off their unblinking faces, while each person mumbled words, fragmented ideas of stories that might potentially be content in a confusing word salad. Norman stopped speaking altogether and realized he should have never came. He followed the cries for help amongst the bodies of people in catatonic states of being. Their unblinking eyes followed him as he moved, though none of them stopped their ceaseless chatter that became background noise. "I'm over here!" yelled the voice. Norman ran over to the sound. It was a man positioned about 2 bodies up in this living wall. "Can you get me down?" the man cried. He was fused to the wall and fitted with wires crisscrossing throughout his body like mechanical veins. "Sure. How?" Norman said quickly and quietly. "I don't know. Just pull something or something." Norman looked around the dimly lit room for something to stand on, a ladder or crane of some sort. He figured they had to have gotten him up there some sort of way. He didn't see anything, so he had to improvise. He slowly climbed onto the shoulders of a man who was mumbling about a 1960s sitcom about a black girl raised by racists in the South. If Norman had just heard that in the wild, he may have chuckled. Norman's weight on the man's shoulder wasn't an issue, and if it was, the man showed no signs of it. He pushed up higher, crawled onto a woman, and found himself level with the man in distress. Norman attempted to pull out a wire in the man's shoulder, but when he did, he howled in pain. "This thing is attached to you?" Norman said in surprise. "I suppose I woke up like this." Norman went into his pocket and pulled a box cutter. Though things had been relatively normal at the job for a few days, he had never stopped bringing the knife with him on the off chance it wasn't. He began sawing at the wires. As he made progress, a black oily liquid oozed out of him, and the pit stirred. Norman had the sinking feeling that something was somehow connected to him, but he couldn't prove it, and he didn't want to. He cut slower and more concisely, somehow making the gentle moaning subside. He sawed at the wires for a while and made slow progress, but at this rate, it may be a few minutes. He whispered to the man he detached. "Why are you up here? I didn't produce enough content for the beast." Norman was terrified to ask him what that meant, so he didn't. "I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know what it was. It was just a figure of speech, I thought. It feeds," he babbled. Norman severed all the wires that dripped with the oily black blood. He gently pulled the man from the wall, but he screamed. Patches of his skin were fused to the wall. Norman looked the man in the eye and said, "What do you want me to do, man? I can try to get help." The man teared up. He knew he'd never be back if he left. "Can you?" Norman slowly put the box cutter to the man's back. "I can't do it," Norman said as the man's skin stretched impossibly. What if I do it wrong, man? Look, I can't do this anymore. If I get out of this building, I'm out of Furlong and I'm never coming back. In fact, I'm gonna live in a cabin in the woods with no internet or TV. None of it happens if you can't get me out of here." Norman took a deep breath and pressed the box cutter to the fused man's skin. Norman stopped and started several times when he was tasked with the gruesome deed of slicing a man's skin off of a wall that he was fused to. The man who was stuck bled slightly just from the extreme weight of gravity pulling down on his skin. He grabbed Norman's hand and gave him reassurance that he was in the right. Norman put the box cutter to the man's skin and slowly pulled it down. Norman handed him one of the discarded cables to bite down on, even though the grunting was still loud and distressing. Every moment was as horrid as the last, and at no point had Norman grown used to this living vivisection. The pit stirred, and Norman could hear a rumble along with the hum of static. The eerie blue glow of this domed room amongst this living wall of wire-fused people became brighter. Norman hurried. The blood dripped onto his sleeves. When the man dislodged, the woman's shoulders he was standing on felt the weight of two men, and she began to scream as her skin stretched and pulled. Norman had no way to land. Both of his hands held on to the man he freed from the hive mind, and he couldn't find a foothold with just his feet to climb down the two people he used to climb up. He retracted the box cutter and let it drop to the ground. He curled himself as best as he could, knowing he would have to absorb the impact of the fall. He fell. Through sheer luck, he managed not to hurt himself. The man he carried was no longer screaming, and it seemed as if he could move his limbs in some capacity. Norman draped the stranger's arm around his shoulder so that they could limp towards the exit. The blue glow was extremely bright, illuminating the placid faces of people whose sole purpose in life was to pitch. The pit rumbled, and a black cable the size of a tree trunk slammed down in Norman's path. The two men ran the other way in this domed room, hoping to get out the way Norman came. A singular glass-orbed eye the size of a semi-truck peered out of the pit. The digital eye glared at the two with curiosity more than anger, but a curiosity the same as a cat that had a mouse dropped at its feet. Norman could see that there was much more of this thing in the pit, but he was running so hard he did not stop to look back. He could hear the garbled melodies of hundreds of television theme songs smashed into one, which came off as a long humming buzz. They dropped to the ground and slinked into the corner. The cable-like tentacle swiped completely past them because it was too massive to traverse into a small nook. He bounded for the door with the man in tow. They stuck to one another like they were Siamese twins. As he reached the darkened hallway, the black tendril pushed up right behind them. They dodged a tremendous blow, having to decouple from one another temporarily to do it. As they moved upwards towards the hidden door in the mailroom, another door opened in the hallway. Norman only managed a quick glimpse, but the room was filled with cameramen fused to the walls and wrapped in cables. One cameraman detached from the wall. The cables that were present all throughout his body released him, and he hopped from the wall and scuttled Norman and the stranger's way. The cameraman was faster than them both and overtook them in a full sprint. The mechanical Cyclops was without his signature poncho now. It was a mess of oily skin. One of the hands were completely fused to the camera, and some of the veins in its broken neck somehow found themselves fused into the plastic of the machine, which pulsed as if it inherited a heartbeat. The cameraman ran around the two and blocked their exit. He moved from side to side. His body was not physically big enough to completely encompass the hallway, but every time they attempted to step past him, the unblinking mechanical eye hovered in their faces. Norman reared back to punch the thing, but not only did it not attempt to dodge it, it leaned into it. He stopped and decided to keep moving. The cameraman made running jumps at Norman, but he did not react. He was beginning to realize that these things thrived on conflict, so if you gave them nothing, they had nothing. He kept moving forward to the exit. The mutated beast opened its mouth, Not the one attached to its broken human head limply fused onto the plastic, but the one under the camera. What could only be described as a zipper of misshapen teeth from an orifice that had no business to exist, opened. Norman flinched when it lunged at him, but he didn't react. The cameraman did nothing. It could not create the chaos, it could only observe it. He pushed past it, hoping that that was the case, and it didn't change its mind. When they pushed into the door in the mailroom, they were clear. They ran for the elevator. As the elevator was in sight, Delphine Osterberg's image suddenly appeared from an empty white wall. "Norman Everman, where are you going?" Norman didn't stop moving with the stranger under his arm. "I'm getting out of here, and with all due respect, Miss Osterberg, I quit." "Well, that is your right if you wish it, but not his," the image of Delphine said, pointing to the man under his arm. "I'm not going back," the stranger said immediately. "I'm sorry, my dear, you signed a contract to produce content for us, so you will produce content for us." "I can't let you do that," Norman intervened. "Oh, is that so?" the old woman said. The elevator door opened with 6 security guards standing inside. "You may go. He must stay." Norman looked to the terrified man with resignation. He wasn't a superhero. There wasn't a world where he could beat 6 guys with batons. The eye of the cameraman was at his back, easing into his personal space for a close-up. Norman pushed the camera away. "Get the f*** away from me!" Norman looked to the man. He wanted to save, but he had to think of his own life and the life of his mother. What could he do? Norman had a thought. "Mrs. Osterberg, might I make a call?" The television image thought for a moment. "Sure, so long as you give me the number and let me dial it," she insisted. "That's fine, even better." Norman gave her the number. The speaker seemed to permeate through the wall. Carlos answered the phone. "Hello, boss." "Hello, this is Delphine Osterberg calling for Norman Everman." "Oh, okay, sure. Hey, man, what's up?" said Carlos. "You still have that Brody Danger thing happening, right?" "Yeah. And technically, I was a pitch man on that idea. I just never signed a contract, right?" Yeah, that's right. Could you tell Mrs. Osterberg how much the project might be hurt if you knew something happened to me?" Yeah. If it was possible to hear someone thinking, it happened right now in real time. Ultimately, Carlos knew he was jammed up. He didn't want to piss off the big boss, but on the other hand, he did consider Norman a friend. "Yeah, I don't think we could do our best work if I was worried about my boy." "So what you're telling me is, if he is doing well, you can guarantee me a hit. Is that what you're saying, my boy?" said Delphine. Yeah, exactly," Carlos said cautiously. "Well, that's all you had to say." The security guard stepped aside and let Norman and the stranger onto the elevator. He didn't know what exactly Carlos had agreed to, but it felt like it mattered. As the elevator doors were about to close, Delphine's projection appeared. "You know, my boy, you signed an NDA, so if you speak to anyone about what you saw here..." Norman nodded knowingly. Even if he did tell, who would believe it? Norman exited the building with the stranger, who thanked him profusely, got in a cab, and left Furlong that very moment. Norman never heard from Carlos, but Brody Danger's next movie was a raging success. And it's done, children. I can tell you, children, if it's that hard getting a job out there, I am glad I've had the same job for thousands upon thousands of years. Could you even imagine the gravedigger queen standing her 7-foot ass next to a water cooler? Did you see that TV show about that thing? Gravedigger queen only happy when that shovel going into that dirt. Do yourself a favor, my sweet little babies. Look for the next cluster of the City of Furlong stories, which will be coming soon, children. Night-night.